Howdy y'all, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be breaking down my CFI Checkride. So this is just a video that I wanted to make as somebody who's recently passed their own CFI Checkride and wants to help those of you that might be coming up on that milestone yourself pass yours. So as many of you are probably aware, I have a series on my channel called the 60-Second CFI, and we recently just finished the Principles of Flight portion of that series. But in regards to my CFI Checkride, as a note, I finished my CFI course about a week ago. As in, I completed the CFI Checkride about a week ago and became a certified flight instructor. So all of this knowledge is still pretty fresh in my head, and I do remember very clearly how the Checkride went. Now we're gonna take this as an opportunity to break down everything you need to know to pass yours. The first thing of note is that you should check the description to find the PTS, or the Practical Test Standards. It will go over everything you will need to know before your CFI Checkride, everything you'll need to bring for your CFI Checkride, and everything that the examiner can ask you about on your CFI Checkride. It is where they get the questions they can ask you from. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the oral. Now, as you probably know, the CFI Checkride is very, very long. It can be up to 8 or even 9 hours. And the longest portion of it is the oral. This can be 6 to 7 hours of ground instruction. Now we're going to go over the different topics you will have to teach now. So the first up, we're going to talk about FOI, or the Fundamentals of Instruction. As a note, you will be teaching 2 FOI courses, at least 2 FOI lessons. The first one, the one that you will have to teach, is Instructor Responsibilities and Professionalism. This will 100% be on your Checkride. The Instructor Responsibilities and Professionalism lesson. Then the examiner has to pick at least one other subject for you to teach. My examiner picked 2. So the other ones that my examiner picked was the learning process and risk management. I had to teach all 3 of these lessons as part of the FOI. Even though I only had to teach 2 as a minimum, my examiner chose 3 for me to teach, so I had to teach all 3. Then we moved on to the technical subject areas. As a note, for the technical subject areas, you are required to teach 3 lessons. 2 of them have already been decided before you even walk into the classroom for your Checkride. The 2 that are mandatory are areas Bravo and Mike. Bravo is runway incursion avoidance. You will have to teach runway incursion avoidance on your Checkride. And Mike is logbook entries and certificate endorsements. You will have to do this. It's not a might, it's not a maybe, it will be on your Checkride 100% of the time. Then the third one is up to the examiner's choosing. So mine picked Principles of Flight. Luckily though, he ended up only making me teach the 5 minimum portions of Principles of Flight. So even though my Principles of Flight lesson has dozens of different subjects that have to be talked about because it is a very, very long lesson, I only had to teach airfoil design characteristics, airplane stability and controllability, turning tendency or torque effect, load factors in airplane design, and wingtip vertices and precautions to be taken. Now, the document showing up on your screen right now while I'm talking about it is what the PTS looks like. As you can see, it says Task Delta, Principles of Flight. It gives you references, it gives you the objective, and it gives you the 5 things you have to talk about. This is incredibly important. When you're making your lesson plans, use those references that it gives you and make sure that all of those numbered items are in your lesson plan. So for reference, just below it is airplane flight controls. There's 2 references, 8083-3 and 8083-25, the same ones for Principles of Flight. And there's 3 different numbered items. So your airplane flight controls lesson plan will have to talk about primary flight controls, trim controls, and wing flaps. So if you are teaching airplane flight controls on your Checkride, your lesson plan must have those 3 things. So the PTS is an absolutely invaluable reference in making your lesson plans and preparing for your CFI Checkride. So for my logbook entries and certificate endorsements lesson, I had to both teach the lesson plan that I had made for this and was also given scenarios by my examiner that I had to know how to walk through. So for reference, one of my scenarios was I'm given a new student who's a brand new student pilot and has no training, no paperwork done, nothing. They walk up to me and go, I want to become a private pilot. And I needed to know all of the endorsements I'd be giving the student from very, very beginning of flight training all the way up to their Checkride. So I had to know all of the pre-solo endorsements, the solo endorsements, the cross-country endorsements, the check ride endorsements, the knowledge test endorsements, all of those. Then he also gave me a specific aircraft and asked me to be his instructor and give him all the endorsements he would need to fly that specific aircraft. Luckily, I got an easy aircraft. It was a P-51 Mustang. So all I had to do was give him his high performance endorsement, his complex endorsement, and his tailwheel endorsement. That's all he needed in order to fly that aircraft. Then, after we finished up the technical subject areas, we moved on to pre-flight preparation. Now for pre-flight preparation, the examiner can pick any topic within this subject area. So for reference, they can pick, as you can see, certificates and documents, weather information, operation of systems, performance and limitations, airworthiness requirements. They can pick any of those. Mine picked airworthiness requirements. And as you can see, it's the same layout as before, but there's a lot more references. Try to use as many of those references as you can when you're making your lesson plans, and stick to your lesson plan when you're teaching them. Now, below that, you can see 5 numbered items. I had to make sure that my lesson plan taught all 5 of those items. As a note, when I was teaching airworthiness requirements, my examiner was much more focused on the aircraft than on really any other portion of my lesson plan. He mainly just asked me to talk about the documents, the inspections, and the equipment needed on board the aircraft. So that one went by pretty smoothly and pretty quickly, to be honest. Then we had to finish up the oral portion of the check ride with a maneuver lesson. Now your examiner can pick any maneuver from areas of operation 7 through 14. Any maneuver in those areas is fair game for your maneuver lesson. Mine chose 8s on pylons. So I had to teach 8s on pylons in my oral. And whatever maneuver you teach during your oral, you will have to do on the flight. So I knew before I even went flying that I was gonna have to do 8s on pylons. Now this one he gave me the day before. The day before he goes, hey, so have 8s on pylons prepared for tomorrow. You're gonna teach it on the ground. And just as a note, that does mean we're gonna have to do it on the flight. So I went, okay. And I prepared 8s on pylons. As we move through the 60-second CFI series, there will be uploads here and there that are me teaching a maneuver lesson. And the first one I do is probably going to be a little bit simpler than 8s on pylons, but we will get around to 8s on pylons, and I will show you guys how I teach the maneuver lesson in a way that did get me a pass on my check ride. Alrighty, so after we finished up the oral, we moved on to the flight portion. Now for the flight, like the oral, the PTS is pretty specific as to what the examiner has to ask you to do and can ask you to do. So let's start going over these subject areas here now. So first up, we have the pre-flight. And as you can see, for the pre-flight procedures, that could be the pre-flight inspection, cockpit management, engine starting, taxiing, land plane. Obviously, you're not going to have to do taxiing for a seaplane unless you're going out for your seaplane rating. Sailing is another seaplane rating thing. And the before takeoff check for both land plane or seaplane. Then after pre-flight, you'll have airport operations. So similarly to the pre-flight inspection, the examiner must select at least one task. Now they can do radio communications and light gun signals. They can do traffic patterns, or they can do airport runway, taxiway signs, markings, and lighting. Now for mine, I didn't have to specifically teach one of these things. We just did traffic patterns while we were doing our takeoffs and landings. And he asked me to describe a traffic pattern. I did so, and he said, okay, great. So that was really all I needed to do for this line item. Now next up, after airport operations, we have takeoffs, landings, and go-arounds. These two kind of go together, as I'm sure you can tell. Now, if you look at the PTS, it does say the examiner must select at least 2 takeoff and 2 landing tasks. Now, my examiner had me do all of them, everything. I did a normal takeoff, I did a short field takeoff, I did a soft field takeoff, which is already 3, that's more than the 2 required. And then for landings, I did a short field landing, I did a soft field landing, I did a normal landing, I did a no flap landing, I did a normal landing with a forward slip into a go around, and I even did a power off 180. So I did pretty much every takeoff and landing I have ever been taught on my CFI Checkride, and I taught all of them. But I will say, my examiner cared a lot more about my ability to do them to ACS than I thought he would. I was told going into my check ride that my examiner was not going to care if I could do it to ACS as long as I could do the maneuver safely. What they were looking for was my ability to teach the maneuver, and that made sense to me because I was already a commercial pilot when I went up for the check ride. So I had already shown an examiner I could do these maneuvers to ACS standards. So I didn't think I was going to have to do them perfectly, just do them well while also teaching how to do them. But the examiner really just wanted me to kind of describe the maneuver and then do it. So just be careful. You could have either type of examiner on your check ride. Then there's also a fundamentals of flight portion of the check ride, where you basically have to teach a very, very basic fundamental of flight, such as straight and level flight, or level turns, or straight climbs and climbing turns. Very basic maneuvers that you wouldn't really even think of as maneuvers, but you have to be able to teach how somebody flies the airplane in a straight line. It's harder than it thinks. It's harder to do than you would think. Now, after that, we have the performance maneuvers section of the check ride. As a note, the only task in performance maneuvers listed for the CFI PTS is steep turns. You will have to do steep turns. It's technically the only performance maneuver that they have to ask you to do. Now, I did steep turns, chandelles, and steep spirals, even though the only one the examiner had to ask me to do was steep turns. I also did steep spirals and chandelles. Not in that order, that wouldn't make much sense, but those are the three that I did. After performance maneuvers, you also have ground reference maneuvers. So this is your rectangular course, turns around a point, S-turns, and 8s on pylons. As a note, 8s on pylons isn't one of the options that they have to pick for your ground reference maneuvers. However, given that I had my pre-flight maneuver lesson on 8s on pylons, I knew I was gonna have to do it on the check ride. Now, your examiner has to pick one of those earlier 3 ground reference maneuvers to do. Has to do turns around a point, S-turns, or rectangular course. Mine chose turns around a point. So I did 2 ground reference maneuvers, really. Turns around a point and 8s on pylons. Then after that, you have slow flight and stalls. Your examiner has to select one slow flight maneuver or stall for you to complete. I didn't do any slow flight. However, I did 3 different stalls. I did a power on stall. I did a power on stall into a secondary power on stall. So secondary stall, both were power on. And then I did an accelerated stall. And I had to teach all 3 of those maneuvers. After slow flight and stalls, you have basic instrument maneuvers. You have multiple different tasks that you could have to do, but the examiner only has to select one. My examiner chose unusual attitudes. So I put on foggles and he put the aircraft into an unusual attitude, and then I had to correct it. But before we did that, I had to teach him how to correct from an unusual attitude. Although he didn't put the foggles on and I put him in an unusual attitude, I just explained what he would have to do to recover, and then he had me demonstrate. Then we have everybody's favorite part of the check ride, emergency procedures. Now you can see on the note here that it says the examiner shall select tasks B or C, D, and one other task. So that one other task could be anything listed for emergency operations. However, you will have to do B or C. So the B is engine failure during takeoff, and C is engine failure after takeoff. So you'll have to do one of those 2 things. And then you'll also have to do D, which is approach and landing with an inoperative engine. So my examiner had me do engine failure after liftoff. We were flying and he pulled throttle and goes, uh-oh, engine failure. Something I'm sure every flight student watching this video is very familiar with. So I had to do the engine failure after liftoff, and I also had to do approach to landing with an inoperative engine. Now, I didn't actually take this all the way to a landing. However, we did do a low approach down to 500 feet, and then we did a go around. And the one other task that my examiner had me do was the emergency equipment and survival gear. I simply had to tell him what emergency equipment and survival gear we had on the aircraft, and he said, okay, great, sounds good to me. So that one was pretty easy. After that, the PTS has a section on multi-engine operations, which you'll only do if you are going up for your multi-engine instructor. So we're not going to touch on that too much. And we'll move on to post-flight procedures. Now, for post-flight procedures, you will have to do task A. Task A for post-flight procedures is post-flight procedures. It's basically your shutdown and your secure checklist. Just do your shutdown checklist and your secure checklist and tell the examiner what you're doing while you do it. That's what I did. It worked great. He was happy. If you're going up for multi or seaplane rating, you will have to do other line items for post-flight procedures. So if you're going up for your seaplane rating as an instructor, you'll have to do anchoring, docking and mooring, beaching, and ramping in order to do all of the post-flight procedures for that rating. But that's not something you have to worry about unless you're going out for your seaplane rating. During this video, I'm sure you've seen many screen recordings come up where it's me reading through an FAA document. That FAA document is most likely the practical test standards, which I have talked about constantly throughout this entire video. It is linked in the description below. Please read through it if you are a CFI applicant going out for your check ride, especially the part that says applicant's practical checklist and examiner's practical checklist. The applicant's practical checklist is the PTS telling you everything you need to have prepared, everything you need to bring, and everything you need in order to take your check ride. It is your practical checklist. Then the examiner's practical checklist is everything the examiner has to ask you about and everything the examiner can ask you about. As a note, they will probably ask you questions that are not explicitly stated in the practical test standards. Answer the question. Just answer the question. They've probably been doing it longer than you have. If you know the answer, answer the question. If you don't know the answer, say that you can check on that or you can find a reference for that, especially during the oral. If they ask you a question during the oral you don't know the answer to, go to the Federal Aviation Regulations, go to the Aeronautical Information Manual, go to the PHAC, go to an FAA source and find the answer to their question, because they will most likely try to find a question you do not know the answer to and ask you that to see how you will react when a student does that exact same thing during a lesson. So thank you guys so much for watching. Please make sure you check the description for all those resources and references I've been talking about this whole time. And the comments section is just below that. If you have any questions I haven't talked about, any comments about my videos, any requests for a future upload, please leave it in the comments. I read all of them. I respond to almost all of them. And I really, really enjoy interacting with you guys. So thank you so much for watching, and I'm wishing you guys the best of luck on your next check ride.